Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Everate's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back with a bit of a full agenda this week. We're going to take a look at the market vibe. It's a nice word for it. I'll give you a film recommendation later. And have a look at this week's Pulse, the Outlook, which just is about to go to subscribers later this week. Some of the moving parts in the current Global Dairy Directions Outlook. Bit of an update on trade and then, of course, chart of the week. So we'll get into it. The vibe, Steve. Well, firstly, in terms of skim milk powder prices, this comparison of the last GDT event and what's happening in the futures markets, they're pretty tightly aligned still, apart from that very kind of bullish end of season signal that came out of the GDT last week that was a little bit hard to understand. It looks like the futures markets haven't followed that up. As much. And then in terms of butter and AMF price comparisons, we've got the EEX futures way up above everybody else there. And from this part of the world, those NZX futures and the AMF results from the latest GDT auction pretty closely aligned, Steve.
Yeah, indicating that, how these reconcile later in the year is going to be quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The European market is starting to improve. It did have that big run-up during May that, we were over there in the middle of that. It's steadied, and just with the return of back to normal after that, those big flooding events, which pushed a bit of surplus liquids onto the market, we've started to see the butter market firm again a little bit, and the futures just in the early contract just picking up a bit there, but certainly the trades of what we've seen of what's trading at the moment is firming. So as we saw when we did this last time, we had a seasonal chart which showed how this rally sort of dies a little bit when the Europeans all go away to these Italian villas and take a big holiday and comes back again in later in Q3.
Mm-hmm.
We're setting up for that again, it looks.
Mm-hmm.
The US cheese market's a little bit weaker, really confused signals around cheese, both demand side and supply side. But what we saw overnight was this big drop in class 3. So less optimistic about the way in which this may develop. I mean, that's quite an interesting chart, how it's just gradually moved weaker in the last few weeks and flattened out. So generally a signal of great uncertainty about how this is going to unfold. So Pulse.
We've had an interesting Pulse result, Steve. Skim milk powder, first of all, dropped $110 from last week's GDT auction, $120 US a tonne down from the previous Pulse, and about $125 south of the current C2 futures. So that's a pretty big drop there, Steve, in terms of skim milk powder. And you've actually picked up a bit of a pattern with the Pulse.
Takes us back to this thing we talked about a few weeks ago, Joe, the predictive powers or not of Pulse when you line it up against the other options. So here, just putting those dots on top, the red dots where it seems to lead,
Down,
up or down, mostly down.
Yes.
In these cases. The blue dots where it looks like it's irrelevant to the major auction outcomes. And over time, so I had a bit of a nerd out on this morning, over time since Pulse started in skim milk powder, we've only had 2 occasions where it's been indicative of a rise in the general auction price. 5 times down and 7 times, irrelevant. So it is tending to be a downward indicator, and we've certainly got that this time, but it's not to say will happen again. We have had this before. Back about 7 or 8 events ago, we saw a similar thing, but let's see where it goes next. But certainly a different vibe to what we had at the last GDT result.
Sure. And whole milk powder, a little bit of a more mature Pulse auction system, I suppose, here. A little less volatile, you'd have to say, Steve. So Pulse lost $40 a tonne this Pulse auction from the GDT auction last week, $72 US a tonne down from the previous Pulse auction. Unlike S&P, and again with a bit more longevity in terms of how long this auction's been running, Steve, more a guide to up than not.
Seems to indicate there might be a different batch of buyers come to this compared to skim milk powder.
Sure.
Versus the usual auction. But anyway, it's interesting to see those. So looking at our outlook, as you know, Joe, we are getting close to wrapping this up, but I will relieve you by not saying we'll talk about all those points. There's just a few call out the major things. I think the most interesting or the bigger moving parts, certainly the US production scenario, while we've got acute problems with young stock, which just seems to be getting tighter and tighter. And layer on that, while the margins might look good, we're hearing that that's not necessarily indicative of what's going on farm in terms of finances. So certainly headwinds for growth in milk output from that respect. Just shoot down a bit, the milk solids growth, however, counters that because that is quite strong, and we will talk about that later in your selected chart issue. Bullish though, butter and cream demand in Europe seems to be good. That cream market is firming. The US domestic cheese market looks like there's some buds of growth there, certainly retailers picking up year on year. When we come down to look at ingredients trade, we have talked about this for a while. We're starting to see that slow as those higher prices push through. On the supply side, New Zealand certainly pushing out far greater MPCs, milk protein concentrates, in terms of their mix. So it indicates they are shifting quite a few solids into that stream to chase particularly the US market, but that's indicative that they may be, trying not to overproduce skim milk powder. And lastly, that uncertain weather. And weather is uncertain everywhere, but that weather and the impact on milk solids yields in Europe. I did read a crop report that came out last week that talked about that the whole cropping situation has been pushed back 2 months. So it is quite a disruption. Anyway, there's some of the highlights.
Sure. Now, some trade updates, Steve. We thought we'd take a look at what's happening in New Zealand exports. So we've got the data from May, and overall, New Zealand dairy exports are down by 8% in milk solids equivalent. And you can just see there, both whole milk powder and skim milk powder exports are down 8% as well, and well down those AMF exports. So some interesting trends there. Cheese and butter a little bit better, holding up a bit more, but it's a pretty negative picture there, Steve, for the last 3 to 6 months after that really big stock clear out earlier this year.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up, as you hinted, this issue with skim milk powder trade. Skim milk powder trade has started to turn down, but a surge in milk protein concentrate exports. You've got to add the two together. So if we, look at that combined skim exports, really, they're up 5% per year. So that is still increasing. So we're not seeing any turn away from the skim side of the product mix yet. In fact, Fonterra has flagged a reduction in whole milk powder sales on GDT, which seems to indicate a mix change.
Yep.
So a little bit towards skim will continue. So this is interesting development as well.
Yeah. The other side of the coin, I guess, when you're talking about New Zealand exports is what's happening with China imports, Steve. And this picture isn't really getting any better. May imports were down 21% in milk solids equivalent terms and 6% weaker in annual terms. So just still trending quite negative. SMP trade was down 22% in annual terms, so that's a big hole there in terms of skim milk powder demand. Butterfat, however, surprisingly perhaps, is holding up even at these quite high prices. So an interesting picture there in terms of fat being pretty good. Cheese had been pretty good, but in this latest month of data, Steve, that's also down year on year for the month.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of contrast there. That fat market is interesting. There's parts of the economy or parts of the market which are, demanding, higher ingredients. So unlike just about everywhere else. Joe, what have you picked? Chart of the week?
Well, chart of the week, US milk production has also just come out for May. It was down 0.9%. It's the 11th consecutive monthly decline in that kind of headline milk production number, Steve. Mostly reflecting fewer cows, as you alluded to earlier, but also lower yield in this latest month, with a few revisions as almost always. But Steve, as you hinted earlier, it's a very different story when you look at milk solids and the trends in milk solids production.
So the latest data we have on this, and it comes out a little while after we get the milk volumes, but the latest data, will come out in a couple of weeks, shows that milk solids growth is running well ahead of milk volume, been consistently doing that for some time. When you look at the extent of that, the growth in solids has been, in this year so far, averaging 1.8% higher. So that's the rate of growth in solids above the growth in milk, or the contraction in milk volume. When you add back the milk sales effect, so fluid milk is declining, so that's also releasing some solids year on year into the market. It makes it around 2%. You consider that some of the central regions, the central upper Midwest, are still growing at greater than 1%. They're still actually adding cows again in those regions. It means we've got about 3% real growth in milk solids coming into those cheese regions. So that's an interesting to watch. Not all of that is ending up cheese plants because cheese production is still struggling in some areas, but it does indicate there's healthy growth in the centre of the country that will continue to feed those plants.
Sure. That's a good vibe, Steve. And if anyone needs a film to watch on a summer's or whatever afternoon, The Castle, pick up the vibe there.
Thanks a lot. See you next time.